There Was a Country by Chinua Achebe. The Recapture of Owerri. The psychological devastated Biafrans were wrestling with two-day prospects in the latter parts of the Harmattan season of 1969: mass starvation or death by organized ethnic cleansing at the hands of Gowon's military. A third possibility, surrender, was not in the cards. By this time, there were close to 100,000 men, women, and children, mainly children, perishing every 6 weeks. The Biafrans would get an emotional reprieve at the news of the recapture of Owerri, one of Biafra's largest cities, from the Nigerian troops. Gowon was furious to learn that Owerri had fallen back into the hands of the army he had sworn to defeat in 3 months. He instituted a major reorganization of his army's leadership. The Nigerian 3rd Battalion was now to be commanded by Olusegun Obasanjo. The 2nd Division switched commanders from Haruna to Lieutenant Colonel Gibson Sanda Jallo, and the 1st Battalion was now led by Brigadier Elia Basala in place of Shua. The next several weeks saw an energized Biafran army engage the federal troops with heightened vigor. They were able to keep the Nigerian army at bay on several fronts across the Imo River, through Uzuakoli to the seat of power of Umuahia and around the perimeter of Owerri, Nekede, and on the road to Aba. Colonel Joseph Achuzia, who had been placed in charge of the Biafran offensive by Ojukwu, even contemplated a major military push to Port Harcourt. The lack of ammunition or military supplies made this lofty goal a suicide mission, and even the radical Joseph A. Reid Achuzia knew his limitations. Achuzia was one of the most complicated, some say eccentric characters of the war. He was well known throughout the East as a no-nonsense, disciplined, tactical, and strategic military genius, and was highly respected, if not feared, by the Nigerian Federal Forces for his mastery of guerrilla warfare and for giving them a run for their money on the battlefield. Military experts report that Achuzia remained Ojukwu's ace commander throughout the conflict, and he was often called upon to solve problems or build upon military theater advantages. His detractors, who referred to him as a war zealot, provide a counterpoint that no action on the battlefield should be elevated to the level of genius, and that Achuzia's desire for military discipline often allegedly meant shooting a number of Biafran soldiers in order to get the others to fall in line. Achuzia survived the conflict and was appointed the Secretary General of the influential Pan-Igbo group Ohaneze Ndi Igbo in later years. Biafra takes an oil rig, the Kwale incident. In the middle of the rainy season of 1969, Biafran military intelligence allegedly obtained information that foreign oil men, particularly staff from the Italian government oil conglomerate Eni, were aiding the Nigerian army. The foreign workers were allegedly providing sensitive military information to the federal forces about Biafran troop positions, strategic military maneuvers, and training. This information was quickly made available to the Biafran command, which swiftly sent soldiers on a stealth-done operation during which they invaded Eni's combine in Kwale, in the Niger River Delta's oil reserve known as Opai Oil Field. By the end of the exercise, 11 workers had been killed. 10 of the dead were Italian, and 1 was from Jordan. The Biafrans took 18 Eni employees hostage. 14 were Italian, 3 were German, and 1 was Lebanese. What happened next would stir international outrage of epic proportions and threaten the fragile emotional and moral support that the Biafrans had developed during the course of the war. The men were quickly detained on Biafran soil, tried, and found guilty of supporting the enemy, the federal troops of Nigeria, to wage a war of genocide. Predictably, there were a spontaneous outcry and appeals for clemency from disparate groups and countries. The Vatican and the embassies of Italy, Germany, Portugal, and Biafra's African supporters, Ivory Coast and Gabon, were at the vanguard of those asking for the release of the prisoners. Biafra's local and international supporters were dismayed. One observer commented at the time, "This indeed was not what the cause was about. We were engaged in a fight for self-determination. This was an unnecessary and costly distraction." Biafran officials were adamant, even obstinate. The enclave's Minister for Information, Ife Gweke, had this to say about the incident. "Oil men are more dangerous than mercenaries. These are the people responsible for our suffering." Ojukwu's own radio pronouncements about the incident were equally irascible. Oscillating amid impassioned outrage and constrained eloquence, the Biafran leader exclaimed, "For 18 white men, Europe is aroused. What have they said about our millions? 18 white men assisting in the crime of genocide. What do they say about our murdered innocents? How many black dead make one missing white? Mathematicians, please answer me. Is it infinity?" After Ojukwu received a private letter from the Pope in June 1969, personally pleading for the release of the Oyo men, many in Ojukwu's inner circle were concerned about an international backlash. If the situation was not resolved swiftly, they feared it could precipitate an instant sinking of Biafra's international reputation and a permanent loss of Vatican, Italian, indeed international humanitarian support. Eventually, in late June 1969, the 18 detained men were released and flown out of Biafra in the custody of diplomats from the Ivory Coast and Gabon. Some scholars believe that Ojukwu's calculation was that a combination of Biafran military resistance and the disruption of oil operations in the region would reduce oil revenue flowing to Nigeria's supporters and into the Nigerian treasury, crippling their war machinery and bringing about an accelerated negotiation to end the war. Others are less charitable and feel that the whole affair was a blunder for the record books. They ascribe Ojukwu's decision to free the men as informed as much by the Pope's letter as by the prospect of Italian armed intervention to free their citizens, and his own rapid tumble from power in such a scenario. Be that as it may, the fact that seemed to have completely escaped the Biafran leaders was this: as a people proclaiming victimization at the hands of Nigeria, and rightfully so, we could not be seen as victimizers in any situation or setting in order to continue receiving the widespread moral and humanitarian support we needed to survive. This failure to recognize this fundamental principle, I believe, contributed immensely to the downturn in Biafra's fortunes. I personally believe that this fiasco was the clearest evidence of the mental fatigue of the Biafran military leadership. The summer of 1969 would prove a busy one on the diplomatic front. Pope Paul VI, buoyed by the success of his emissaries in diffusing the Kuala incident, focused his energies next on procuring a lasting peace between the warring parties. During an official trip to Uganda, the pontiff met the Biafran and Nigerian emissaries separately in lengthy talks during which he expressed his desire that a peaceful resolution be found. The pontiff addressed the Ugandan parliament on August 10th, following an exhausting ceremony during which he consecrated 12 new African bishops and repeated the Vatican's desire to mediate a lasting peace between Nigeria and Biafra. In a region of Africa dear to us, there still rages an organizing conflict. We have not only sought to secure goods and medical assistance impartially and by every means available, but have also tried to apply the remedy of a certain initial reconciliation. Up to now, we have not succeeded, and this gives us heartfelt pain. But we are resolved to continue our modest but affectionate and fair efforts of persuasion to help heal this fatal dissension. In America, the Nixon administration increased diplomatic pressure on the Gowon administration to open up avenues for international relief agencies at about the same time, following months of impasse over the logistics of supply routes. Many Congress members, government officials, indeed lay citizens were increasingly exasperated by the endless streaming television imaging of dying Biafran babies and by the blockade imposed by the Gowon government. Biafra had in Senator Edward M. Kennedy a humane and sympathetic ear. Kennedy called for early and sustained U.S. humanitarian intervention throughout the bloody conflict. Strom Thurmond, a senator from South Carolina, also became particularly vocal about America's intention to continue providing relief supplies to the needy irrespective of the Nigerian federal government's obstinate blockade measures. Thurmond, an unlikely supporter of the breakaway Republic of Biafra, was a former Dixiecrat, a member of the Conservative based on the old Democratic Party of the 1950s and early 1960s that fled to the safety of the Republican Party following the reverberations of the Civil Rights period. He also had a not too flattering reputation for commandeering the filibusters of the Civil Rights Act of 1957. He was, however, a well-respected and high-profile congressman and a particularly effective legislator, all the characteristics that the desperate Biafrans needed. Biafran diplomats began to see some of the repercussions of the Kuala incident by the end of 1969 and the erosion of the goodwill that had been built up so successfully over the previous 27 months. Neutral countries like Canada, hitherto officially silent, more or less, while engaged in spirited humanitarian support of the suffering, openly criticized the Ojukwu administration as one that was more interested in getting arms than food or medical supplies and had made up reasons for rejecting humanitarian aid. For the Biafrans, particularly those of us who had made trips to Canada to secure the humanitarian support, this rhetoric was particularly devastating.